They called Mazina in front of everyone. The pastor pointed his finger in my face, and the entire congregation looked at me like I was a monster. They threw me out of the church as if I didn't even have the right to breathe the same air as them. But what no one imagined is that very night, God would use me to save a life, and that's when everyone discovered who I really was. My name is Michael, and if you saw me today, you might not imagine where I came from. I wasn't born in a big city or into a wealthy home. I grew up in a small town in the American countryside where everyone knew everyone. The streets were simple, the houses had white picket fences, and the most common noise was the children running after school or the church bell ringing on Sundays. My mom, Sarah, was the most important person in my life, a simple woman, but with unshakable faith. I remember Sunday mornings when she would open my bedroom window, letting the sunlight in and say, "Come on, Michael, it's time to get ready for the house of the Lord." I didn't understand much about faith at the time, but I loved the way she looked at me when I was in church. It was as if she believed that there I could be protected from all the evil in the world. My father, on the other hand, wasn't as present. He worked a lot, and when he was home, he seemed to carry a weight I could never explain. Sometimes he was dry, sometimes explosive, and there were days when you simply retreated into silence. Perhaps that's why I always clung so closely to my mother and the church environment. It was the only place where I felt I could breathe without fear. As a child, I was like any other kid. I liked to play baseball in the backyard. I dreamed of owning a new bike and spent hours imagining that one day I would become a professional footballer. But above all, I dreamed of having a normal life, without any major problems. I wanted to get married, have children, work hard, and maybe even live in the same town where I grew up. It was a simple but pure dream. The church was the center of the community. On Sundays, entire families would gather there. Women wore colorful dresses, men wore starched shirts, and children ran through the aisles before the service began. I would sit next to my mother and sing the hymns, even though I didn't quite understand the meaning of the words. For me, it represented security. As the years passed, I began to distance myself a little from this world. Adolescence brought with it restlessness and a desire to try new things. I saw my older friends driving cars, going out to parties, experimenting with things the church would never approve of. Little by little, I distanced myself from the innocence of childhood, but there was still a flame inside me. Every time my mother held my hand and prayed with me before bed, I felt that somehow I still belonged to something greater. When I finished school, life pushed me down difficult paths. There weren't many opportunities in the city. I needed to help out at home, but honest work was scarce. Then came the bad company, the wrong choices, and inevitably, prison. But that part of the story isn't for now. What matters is the contrast. Before everything fell apart, I was just a young man who wanted to be accepted, loved, and respected. After I served my sentence and returned home, the first thing I thought was, I need to start over. I need to return to God. My mother always said that church was a family, a place where everyone was welcomed, regardless of their background. That idea stuck with me. So even though I was scared, I decided to return to that place that had meant so much to me as a child. I remember well the first time I walked through those doors in years, the smell of varnished wood, the long benches, the stained glass windows illuminated by the morning sun. Everything was exactly as before. It was as if no time had passed. But inside, I was no longer the same. I carried marks that no one there could see, but which weighed heavily on every step I took. When I walked in, a few people recognized me. Some smiled tightly, others looked away. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. I sat down on one of the middle benches, closed my eyes, and took a deep breath. I was there for God, not for people. The choir began to sing, and for a moment I felt as if I'd gone back in time, as if I were that boy again beside my mother. But this time, There was a different silence in the air. I could hear the glances, the whispers. My mind screamed, "They know your past. They won't accept you." Despite this, my heart insisted on believing there was a place for me there. I thought about how happy my mother would be to see me back on God's path. I thought that maybe, just maybe, this would be the first step toward rebuilding my life. At that moment, I didn't yet know what was coming. I wasn't yet aware of the pain, rejection, and humiliation that awaited me. I only knew one thing. I was ready to try, even if it meant facing suspicious looks and closed hearts. And this is where my story begins to change. Because the same faith that led me to those doors was the same faith that sustained me when the world came crashing down on me. I always believed that God's forgiveness was greater than any mistake. That's what kept me going inside the prison when the nights were cold and long and the loneliness seemed to crush me. I kept repeating to myself, when I get out, I'll start over. I'll be a new man. And part of that fresh start for me meant going back to church. In my mind, church was the place where I would find open arms. I remembered my mother saying, "God's house is for everyone, Michael. No sinner is greater than the Lord's love." Those words gave me strength, so when I summoned the courage to walk through those doors again, I carried real hope in my heart. But hope is fragile when it meets judgment. That Sunday, the service had begun normally. The choir sang, the children laughed in the aisles, and I tried hard to appear invisible. I just wanted to hear the word, feel some peace, and maybe believe there was a place for me there. However, the pastor was enough, David seeing me sitting in the middle seat for the atmosphere to change. I noticed. The tone of his voice wavered, a few people's eyes turned to me, and silence fell for a few seconds. It was as if I'd brought a shadow with me. I tried to ignore it. I lowered my head, closed my eyes, and began to pray silently. I asked God, "Lord, please don't let my past speak louder than your grace." But it was useless. Halfway through the service, the pastor stopped preaching. His voice was firm, but filled with judgment. He looked directly at me and said, "Brothers, we must be vigilant. The enemy prowls around like a lion, and not everyone who enters through these doors comes with a sincere heart." My heart raced. I knew he was talking about me. Some people looked around, confused, but others were already certain. I heard whispers, fingers pointing softly. I cringed, hoping it would stop there, but it didn't. The pastor took a few steps, gripped the microphone tightly, and then pointed his finger in my direction. "There are people here who carry the label of sinner, criminals who try to blend in among the saints. This place is not for the filthy of heart." It was like a knife stabbing me in the chest. I didn't know whether to stay or get up. My legs were shaking, my hands were sweating. I felt the ground spin beneath me. People started moving away from my bench, as if I were contagious. One woman pulled her young daughter by the arm, as if she needed to protect her from me. The air grew heavy, difficult to breathe. I wasn't just being watched. I was being exposed. I will never forget the look in his eyes. Emily, a young woman who had grown up with me in that same church. When we were children, we sat side by side in Bible school. Now, her eyes were filled with fear. She no longer saw the boy she knew, but the ex-con everyone feared. The pastor continued speaking, as if I were not a person, but an example to be used. If there is no true repentance, there is no place in the house of God. Sin must be cast out, so that the body is not defiled. In that instant, everything inside me shattered. I no longer heard the exact words, only the echo of a condemnation. The sound of voices mixed with the murmur of the congregation sounded like a courtroom. And I was alone, being judged again, but this time not by a judge of the law, but by those who claimed to represent God's love. I wanted to scream. I wanted to stand up and say, "You don't know about my nights of prayer. You don't know about the tears I shed asking for forgiveness. You don't know about the struggle I fought to change." But nothing came out of my mouth. My throat was dry, as if the words were stuck deep inside me. Then suddenly the shepherd ordered, "Get up and leave." This is not your place." It was the most profound humiliation I'd ever experienced. I stood up slowly, the weight of the world on my shoulders. Stairs pierced me like knives. Each step toward the door was a reminder that I wasn't welcome, that my past was greater than any attempt at a fresh start. When I reached the door, I glanced back for just a second. What I saw destroyed me. People who had once smiled at me now looked at me with disgust, as if I were the devil himself. I walked outside, and the cold morning wind hit my face, but the worst cold was inside me. I sat down on the sidewalk, hid my face in my hands, and cried. I cried like I hadn't cried since I was a child. At that moment, I realized something painful. Prison hadn't been just 4 concrete walls. The real prison was the judgment of people. I had served my sentence before the justice of men, but before the community, before the church, I remained condemned. And the worst part was the feeling of injustice, because deep down I knew my regret was real. I knew I had changed, but they didn't see that. They only saw the scars of my past. That was the first wound, the public rejection, the humiliation in front of everyone. It wasn't just an insult. It was a mark etched on my soul, one that would echo for a long time. And there, sitting on the sidewalk with my eyes swollen from crying, I asked myself, did God also expel me? Am I really just a sinner with no place in the world or in heaven? This doubt was the beginning of my biggest struggle. After that fateful morning, when I was thrown out of church in front of everyone, I thought the worst was over. The humiliation, the public judgment, the finger pointing at me as if I were enemy number 1. It all seemed unbearable. But I was wrong. That was just the beginning. Life in the small town allowed no room for secrets. Within a few hours, everyone knew about the episode. People didn't need to hear it directly from the pastor because the news spread by word of mouth like wildfire. Within days, I was no longer just the ex-con trying to reintegrate. I was the man who dared to enter the church as if he were a saint and was thrown out in front of everyone. The streets that once seemed familiar became an invisible battlefield. I walked down the sidewalk and noticed mothers pulling their children to the other side. Childhood friends pretended not to see me. The disapproving looks were everywhere, at the supermarket, at the gas station, even at the baseball diamond where I used to play as a kid. At first, I tried to convince myself it was just paranoia, that maybe I was misinterpreting. But it wasn't long before reality crushed me. I heard the whispers. I heard my name spoken with disdain. "That's Michael, the criminal. Did you see? He tried to infiltrate the church, but the pastor kicked him out." These kind of people never change. Each sentence was like a brick being stacked on my back, pushing me further and further down. I tried to resist. I tried to keep my faith, remember God's promises, my mother's words about the Lord's unconditional love. But the more I clung to it, the stronger the rejection seemed. One day, passing through the main street of the city, I saw Emily and other young women who attended church. They were standing in front of a coffee shop, laughing and chatting. When they saw me, the laughter suddenly stopped. One of them whispered something in the other's ear, and they all looked at me with contempt. Emily, who had once been my childhood friend, turned her face away as if I were invisible. That simple scene struck me like an arrow. It wasn't just strangers who rejected me, but people who grew up with me, who knew my family, who knew who I was before I fell. And it didn't stop there. One night, I decided to go back to church, even after what had happened. I thought, maybe it was an exaggeration. Maybe the pastor was having a bad day. Who knows, maybe if I show humility, they'll take me back. I entered discreetly, sitting in the last pew without attracting attention. But it only took a few minutes for the stares to begin again. The service had barely begun when 2 deacons approached me. Their faces were hard, without compassion. One of them, Mark, put his hand on my shoulder and said in a low but firm voice, "You need to leave. The pastor made it clear. Don't insist." I looked into his eyes, trying to find a trace of mercy, but there was none. only judgment. I slowly got up and walked out again, each step echoing louder than it should have. Outside, the night chill enveloped me, but the greater chill was within. I wasn't just rejected, I was being kicked out repeatedly, like an intruder in a place that had once been my home. With each attempt, the tension increased. People I'd never met began treating me as a threat. I became a cautionary tale, an example used in conversations to justify fear. See, this is why you can't trust ex-convicts. They may even feign remorse, but deep down, they remain the same. Oh, it was as if my identity had been reduced to a single label, irredeemable sinner. The injustice was suffocating. I knew of my regret. I knew of the sleepless nights, praying, asking for forgiveness, promising God I would do things differently. I knew my life had changed, but to them none of that mattered, and the more I tried to resist, the deeper the conflict deepened. My presence was seen as provocation, my search for faith was interpreted as falsehood. There was no place where I could rest in peace. Even at work, where I was trying to rebuild my life, the shadow of rejection followed me. I landed a simple job at an auto repair shop, thanks to an old acquaintance who decided to give me a chance. But soon, the rumors started to trickle in there too. Customers whispered. Some even refused to bring their cars in just because they knew I worked there. The owner was starting to get annoyed, and I could feel that I would soon lose even that livelihood. Little by little, I began to isolate myself. I avoided leaving the house. I avoided meeting people. Solitude was the only place where I didn't have to face accusing stares. But even alone, the weight of rejection continued to crush me. My mind wouldn't shut off. I heard the pastor's words echoing within me again. This is not your place. Get up and leave. And I asked myself, if I don't belong there, then where does? Where can someone like me belong? The conflict wasn't just external, it was growing within me. It was a war between what I believed about God's forgiveness and what the world insisted on showing me. I wanted to believe there was hope, but every gesture of rejection, every harsh word, every closed door pushed me away from faith. There were days when I looked in the mirror and almost believed what they said. I almost believed that I was just a sinner with no future, a criminal who could never change. And it was at that point that I realized the injustice had escalated into something even greater. It wasn't just the rejection of the church or the city, it was the risk that I myself would begin to reject who I was trying to become. After that night when I nearly ended my own life, I woke up different. I wouldn't say I woke up renewed, full of faith or hope. No, I was still broken, still empty. But there was one strange thing: I was alive. Just opening my eyes the next morning brought me a contradictory feeling. Part of me thought, why am I still here? But another part whispered, you still have a chance. I got up slowly, my body heavy, my head throbbing from the drink and tears of the night before. I walked through the silent house, looked out the window and saw the city going on as usual. People going to work, children going to school, the sun illuminating the streets, while I felt like I was frozen in time. At that moment, I decided I had to get out. If I stayed locked in that room, in that darkness, I would destroy myself. So without much thought, I threw on the first clothes I could find, put on a cap to hide my face, and left. I walked aimlessly. I passed streets that brought back painful memories, but I kept going, until my steps took me, almost without realizing it, near the church. My heart raced when I saw the building in the distance. Part of me wanted to cross the street and run away, but suddenly I heard a sound that made me stop. Screams. They were desperate screams. I instinctively ran closer, and that's when I saw the scene that would change everything. In front of the church, a group of people were in a panic. A child, about 6 or 7 years old, was in her mother's arms, choking. She was struggling, her eyes wide, unable to breathe. Chaos ensued. Someone screamed for an ambulance, others just cried in despair. The pastor David I was there, trying to pray out loud, but visibly not knowing what to do. I froze for a few seconds. Everything inside me told me not to interfere. After all, that wasn't my place. They'd thrown me out, humiliated me, called me a sinner. Who was I to show up there? But then something inside me spoke louder. I remembered a course I'd taken in prison. It was basic first aid training. At the time, I hadn't really appreciated it, but now those instructions came back to me like a flash. Without thinking, I ran toward the child. The mother, in despair, tried to push me away. "No, don't touch him!" he shouted, his eyes full of fear and revulsion. But I didn't listen. I picked up the boy, bent him over, and began applying the maneuver I'd learned. I pressed down, hit him on the back, and repeated the movement, while everyone stared at me in horror, as if I had no right to even touch that child. For a few seconds, I felt the weight of everyone's judgment, but I didn't stop. I knew what I was doing. I knew that in that moment, that child's life depended on it. And then, suddenly, I heard the most beautiful sound of my life. A loud choke, followed by a cough. The piece of food that had been blocking his throat came out, and the boy took a deep breath, crying out. Silence fell over the place. The child's cries echoed like music, but no one said anything. Everyone was paralyzed. The mother held her son in her arms again, now in tears, thanking God for his life. Pastor David, microphone still in hand, seemed in disbelief at what had just happened. People looked at me with a mixture of shock and shame. I stood there, speechless. My heart was pounding, and my hands were shaking. I didn't need recognition, I didn't need applause. But in that moment, something shifted inside me. For the first time in a long time, I felt worthwhile, that I wasn't just an ex-convict, a condemned sinner, an outcast. I had been useful, I had made a difference, and no one could deny that. As I walked to leave, I heard a voice behind me. It was Emily. "Michael," he said softly. I turned my face and saw her eyes filled with tears. They were no longer tears of fear or contempt. They were tears of gratitude, of recognition. At that moment I realized something powerful. God had used my scars to bring life. That course I took in prison, the place where I was humiliated and rejected, had become a tool of salvation. And then, for the first time in months, I felt a thread of hope pierce my heart. It wasn't big, it wasn't enough to heal all the wounds, but it was real, and I held on to it. That night, lying in bed, I prayed again, but this time the words didn't seem so far away. I said, "God, if you still have plans for me, show me. Because today I saw that I can still be useful. Don't let this flame go out." And in the silence of the night, for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel completely alone. After that day in front of the church, when God used my hands to save a child's life, something began to change. It didn't happen immediately, as if by magic. The community didn't transform overnight. The suspicious looks still lingered, the whispers still echoed as I passed. But there was something different in the air. A seed had been planted. I felt the difference within myself. For the first time in a long time, I didn't see myself as just the ex-con or the sinner. I had done something no one could deny. I had saved a life. This didn't erase my past, but it showed that my present could be different. In the following days, people who had previously crossed the street to avoid me began to look at me differently. It wasn't yet acceptance, but it wasn't just condemnation either. It was as if, for the first time, they had doubts about the image they had built of me. The boy's mother, Rebecca, was one of the first to reach out to me. She knocked on my door 2 days after the incident. When I opened it, I was surprised. I expected to see hatred or distrust, but I found gratitude. "Michael, I don't know how to thank you. You saved my son. I didn't know what to think of you before, but now I know that God really does use people in ways we don't understand." Her words entered my heart like balm. I almost didn't know how to respond. I just said, "I just did what anyone would do." But she shook her head and corrected me. "No, Michael, no one knew what to do. Only you acted. It was God." After she left, I kept thinking about that sentence. It was God. For so long, I had wondered where God was. in those dark nights, in the humiliations, in the looks of contempt. And now, realizing that he had used me precisely through something I learned in the place where I suffered most, prison was like seeing a piece of the puzzle. And it didn't stop there. That Sunday, I decided not to go back to church. I didn't want to go through the embarrassment of being kicked out again. But to my surprise, someone came to my house. It was Mark, one of the deacons who had accompanied me to the door when the pastor ordered me to leave. He was visibly uncomfortable, fidgeting with his hands. Finally, he said, "Michael, I came because I wanted to apologize. I obeyed the pastor that day, but seeing what you did for Jacob made me think maybe we judged wrongly." I was silent for a few seconds, absorbing those words. A man who had once been the instrument of my humiliation now stood before me, acknowledging his mistake. It wasn't complete redemption yet, but it was a clear sign that the tide was beginning to turn. As the days passed, the townspeople began talking less about the criminal and more about the man who saved the boy. The narrative shifted. The label hadn't completely disappeared, but it was being challenged, and that was already a victory. The pastor himself, David, seemed uncomfortable. I noticed it in his eyes when we passed each other on the street. Before, he looked at me with superiority, as if to say, "You don't belong here." But after what happened, there was something different in his gaze. It was as if his authority had been shaken. After all, he had cast me out as an unworthy sinner. But when an innocent life was at risk, it wasn't him who God used, it was me. That detail burned inside him, I knew. And in a way, that was poetic justice beginning to dawn. One afternoon, while walking through the city, I came across Emily unlike before. She didn't look away. On the contrary, she moved closer. "Michael, I wanted to apologize to you too. I was wrong about you. We grew up together. I should have remembered who you really were, but I let fear and the comments blind me." Her words touched me deeply. I've always carried the pain of seeing people who'd known me since I was little treating me like a stranger, like a monster. Hearing Emily acknowledge this was like a weight lifted from my heart. That night when I got home, I fell to my knees and cried. But this time, they weren't tears of despair. They were tears of relief, of gratitude. I said, "Lord, I still don't understand why I'm in so much pain, but thank you. Thank you because you showed me that it's not over. Thank you because I can still be an instrument of your love." The most impressive thing is that even in the midst of rejection, even without being officially accepted back into the church, I no longer felt alone. I knew God was with me, and that he was slowly turning things around. The turning point didn't come through pretty speeches, nor through a public apology. The turning point began with small gestures, with changing perspectives, with people deciding to question the narrative constructed against me. And within me, the biggest turning point was this. I finally realized that I didn't need everyone's approval to continue. What I needed was God's approval. It was during this period that I started leaving the house more again. I started helping neighbors with small tasks, even without receiving anything in return. I changed a light bulb here, fixed a gate there. People were surprised because they didn't expect it from me. But that was exactly what I wanted, to show with my actions that I wasn't who they said I was, and each simple gesture was another brick in the reconstruction of my identity. I didn't yet know what was coming, but I could already sense that history was changing. The same place that had humiliated me, that had rejected me, was beginning to be the stage for my restoration. And deep down, I was sure it was just the beginning. Life has a strange way of bringing us face to face with those who have hurt us. I knew that at some point I would have to face the pastor, David, the man who cast me out in front of everyone, who called me a sinner, who condemned me as if he had the right to decide whether or not I was worthy of God's love. Until then, our encounters had always been brief, silent, and filled with hard looks. But deep down, I felt this confrontation was approaching, and I was right. The opportunity came one Sunday night. I hadn't planned on going to church, but after so many conversations with people who had begun to change their view of me, I felt a strange courage. Something inside me said, "It's time to come back." Not to justify yourself, but to show that you're no longer afraid. I put on a simple shirt, took a deep breath, and walked to the building that had once represented my greatest pain. Each step toward the door was an internal battle. My mind told me to go back, but my heart insisted between. When I opened the door, I felt the weight of those stairs again. Some still held suspicion, others showed surprise. But this time there was also respect. I was no longer just the cast-out sinner. I was the man who had saved Jacob. I sat on the same bench where it all began, in the middle of the room, without hiding. I wanted to make it clear that I wasn't there to run away. The service began. Praises were sung, prayers were offered. Pastor David stepped to the pulpit, Bible in hand, and a steady voice. But when his eyes met mine, I sensed something different. There was discomfort. He lost his rhythm for a few seconds, but soon regained it. For much of the sermon, he seemed to be speaking indirectly to me. He would say things like, "There are those who pretend to transform, but remain the same inside. It is not enough to have good works. Purity of heart is necessary." And each sentence was an attempt to get through to me, to remind the congregation that, despite what I had done, I still carried a past. But this time, I didn't bow my head. I stood there, staring, not shying away. At the end of the service, something happened. Jacob's mother, Rebecca, stood up and asked to speak. There were tears in her eyes, but also determination in her voice. "Pastor brothers, I cannot remain silent. Everyone here knows what happened to my son. Everyone knows he would be dead today if it weren't for Michael. The same man who was thrown out of this place was used by God to save my child's life. And I ask, who are we to deny that God is in his life?" The room fell silent. I felt my heart pound. Never had anyone stood up for me like that. Pastor David tried to intervene, but she wouldn't let him. "With all due respect, Pastor, I know what I saw. I saw the power of God working through Michael. And I will not accept that they continue to treat him as a worthless sinner, because to me he is an instrument in the hands of the Lord." Her words were like an earthquake inside the church. Many people began to murmur, others nodded in agreement. It was as if, finally, the truth was coming to light, and then something unexpected happened. Several people began to stand up, one by one, sharing their testimonies about how I'd helped in small ways over the past few weeks. The neighbor whose gate I'd fixed, the elderly woman I'd brought groceries to, even Emily, who publicly confessed that she'd misjudged me and now saw me differently. I sat in silence, listening to all of this. It was as if God was speaking to me through the mouths of those people. Pastor David, visibly under pressure, tried to end the service quickly, but it was impossible. The atmosphere had changed. The confrontation I feared wasn't shouting or angry. It was a silent but powerful confrontation. Truth versus lies, love versus judgment. Finally, as everyone was leaving, the pastor came up to me. His eyes were filled with wounded pride and embarrassment. He tried to maintain his composure, but his voice was no longer firm. "Michael, maybe I was too hard on you." I took a deep breath. The anger I once had for him was gone. I simply said, "Pastor, I don't need you to accept me. What I need is to continue being faithful to God, because He is the one who forgave me. But I hope that one day you will understand that it is not man who decides who can and cannot be used by him." He didn't answer. He just looked down and walked away. In that instant, I realized the confrontation was over, not because he apologized, not because there was a formal agreement, but because, for the first time, the truth prevailed, and there was no turning back. I left church that night with a light heart. Not because everyone now accepted me, but because I had faced my greatest fear and stood tall. The confrontation wasn't just with Pastor David, but with all the pain of my past, and this time, I didn't run away. That night after the confrontation, I returned home with my heart racing. I couldn't sleep. Every word spoken, every look exchanged, every testimony given in my defense echoed within me. For so long I had lived as if I were in the dock, being tried without the right to defend myself. But for the first time, I saw people standing up and saying, "He's changed. He's not what you say he is." It was as if the chains that held me back inside began to break. I was no longer just the ex-con. I had a name, I had a voice, I had value. In the following days, something extraordinary began to happen. The same people who had previously rejected me began to seek me out. At first, they came shyly, almost embarrassed, but they came. Some apologized, others just wanted to talk, hear my side of the story, understand how I had managed to change, and I spoke. I hid nothing. I talked about my mistakes, my failures, but I also talked about prison, about nights of prayer, about sincere repentance, and about how God gave me the strength to start over. Each conversation was like a scar exposed to light. It hurt, but at the same time, it truly healed. The biggest surprise, however, was when Mark, the deacon who kicked me out the first day, came to me again. This time, he didn't just come on his own behalf. He came on behalf of the entire church council. "Michael, we've come together, and after everything that's happened, we believe we owe you a public apology. We wronged you. We wronged you badly." I remained silent, trying to process those words. For months, they had been the weight that crushed me. And now they were before me, acknowledging my mistake. The following Sunday, the scene that unfolded inside the church was one I'll never forget. The service was packed, and at the end, the board itself asked to speak. Pastor David was present, visibly uncomfortable, but he couldn't help himself. Mark took the floor. "Brothers and sisters, a few months ago, we judged and condemned a man in front of everyone. We expelled him, humiliated him, and told him he had no place here. Today, before God and this congregation, we acknowledge our error. Michael, on behalf of the leadership of this church, we ask for forgiveness." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The very place that had been the scene of my greatest pain was now the scene of my restoration. The silence that followed those words was broken by applause. People who had previously looked at me with disdain now clapped, some crying. I stood, my eyes brimming with tears, unsure of what to do. It was then that Rebecca, Jacob's mother, brought her son to me. He hugged me with that innocent, childlike way and said, "Thank you for saving my life." Those words destroyed me inside, but in a good way. Everything I was carrying, heaviness, rejection, and pain, seemed to melt away. The most striking thing was seeing Pastor David's reaction. For the first time, he was out of control. His look was no longer one of superiority, but of shame. He said nothing that day, but his image as an unshakable leader was shattered. The poetic revenge wasn't me raising my voice against him. It wasn't me humiliating him in front of everyone. It was simply the truth imposing itself. It was God showing, before the entire congregation, that the one they called a sinner was precisely the one he chose to be an instrument of life. I didn't need to justify myself. I didn't need to defend myself. The circumstances themselves spoke for me. After that service, my life changed. It wasn't that all the doors suddenly opened or that everyone accepted me, but the label that had haunted me, that of being just a criminal, had lost its hold. Now I was also the man God used to save a child. This new title gave me something I hadn't had in a long time: dignity. The following weeks were transformative. People began calling me to help with small jobs, not just because they needed me, but because they trusted me. The same shop that had let me go called me back. This time the owner said, "Michael, I messed up. I want you back here. The whole town saw who you are." Returning to that job was symbolic. It was like closing a cycle, but the greatest victory was internal. I no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. I knew who I was in God, and that was enough. One day, walking through the city, I stopped in front of a shop window mirror. I looked at my reflection and almost didn't recognize myself. Not because my face had changed, but because my eyes were no longer dull. There was life there was hope, and I smiled. I really smiled, like I hadn't in years. Redemption wasn't just being accepted back into the church or hearing a public apology. True redemption was understanding that my worth was never in what people said about me, but in what God always knew. I was humiliated, rejected, and cast out. But in the end, it was precisely in this scenario that God displayed his glory. And looking back, I realize, if I hadn't gone through the pain, I might never have known the depth of this restoration. After everything I've been through, I sometimes find myself thinking about how a single word can change someone's destiny. Sinner. That was the word they used against me, like a final sentence. No matter how much I had changed, no matter how much I repented, no matter how much faith I tried to rebuild, to them, I was doomed. But in the end, that wasn't the word that defined my life. It was another son, because beyond any human label, that's who God always said I was. Even when everyone turned their backs on me, even when I was cast out, humiliated and forgotten, he never stopped seeing me as his child. Today, when I walk the streets of my city, I no longer feel the weight of those stares I once did. There are still those who judge me, of course. There always will be. But I've learned that I no longer live for people's approval. I live for God's approval. The church where it all happened is still there. The same building, the same doors, the same wooden pews. I still go there sometimes. Not because I need to prove anything, but because that place, which was once the stage of my pain, has also become the setting for my restoration. It's as if God has shown me that he has the power to transform even the environments that hold our worst memories. And every time I walk in there, I remember the scene that changed everything. Jacob, that little boy, breathing again in my arms. That wasn't just a miracle for him. It was a miracle for me. It was as if God said, "Michael, you're still useful. I still have plans for you." This miracle didn't erase my past, but it gave it new meaning. Even what I learned in prison, that seemingly insignificant first aid course, was used by God. This taught me that nothing is wasted. Even the darkest parts of our history can become tools in his hands. I'm no longer the man who walked through the church door desperately seeking acceptance. Today, I walk with dignity, knowing I'm already accepted by the only one who truly matters. And that changes everything. Of course, I still carry scars. Some people still give me dirty looks, still whisper behind my back. But today, I see these scars not as shame, but as testimony. They tell the story of someone who fell, but got back up. Of someone who was rejected, but found value in God's love. My mother Sarah, if she were alive, would smile when she saw me. I can imagine her hugging me and saying, "I knew it, son. I knew God had something bigger for you." And that memory gives me strength every day. Today, I help people who are going through similar situations to mine. Ex-convicts, outcasts, forgotten by society. When I talk to them, I see the same look in their eyes I had, of someone who feels like they have no place in the world. And I say, "You are not what you have done. You are not what they say about you. You are what God says you are." And every time I say this, I feel like my story takes on meaning, because it's not just about me. It's about everyone who has ever been called a sinner, rejected, unworthy. It's about showing that redemption exists. Pastor David, he never had the same attitude toward me again. He's still a leader, he's still preaching, but I know something has changed inside him. He no longer looks at me the way he used to. It's not friendship, it's not intimacy, but it's also no longer condemnation. And that's enough. I don't need him to recognize me, because my poetic revenge has already happened. The same altar he used to expel me was the place where my restoration was recognized by all. That is enough. Looking back, I see that every tear, every lonely night, every humiliation had a purpose. If I hadn't been rejected, I might never have known the power of true forgiveness. If I hadn't hit rock bottom, I might never have understood that God's grace is what truly sustains me. And if I had given up on that dark night when I held the knife in my hands, none of this would have happened. Jacob wouldn't have been saved. My life would have ended as a story of defeat. But God, in His mercy, held me. Today, when I close my eyes, I no longer see the scene of me being thrown out of the church. I see another image, me walking out those doors, head held high, feeling finally free. Not from the prison of men, but from the prison of judgment. And no one can take that freedom away from me. So if you ask me what I learned from all this, I would say this. I learned that rejection from people is not the end. I learned that even scars can be used by God. And I learned that in the end, it doesn't matter what others say. It matters who you choose to be before God. This is my story. The story of a man who was called a sinner, cast out, humiliated, but who, in the end, discovered that he was already a beloved son. And when I close the church door behind me, I feel a peace in my heart that I've never known before. Because now I know I don't need to prove anything anymore. I'm already free.